Hi and welcome to NewsReal with Joe and Neil.
I'm Joe.
And I'm Neil. And welcome to your weekly antidote to fake news. Not a lot happened this week, Joe. Nothing major anyway. So I figured we'd take the opportunity to discuss something that's kind of a trend. It's been going on for a while. It's happening at a steady pace and it's happening all over the world. We know it best in the West as the election of Donald Trump. In the US and in the UK, not the election of anyone yet, but the Brexit issue, the Brexit referendum, the rise of nationalism.
I just clutched my pearls.
Indeed, well, the Western media does that routinely. I mean, obviously, with those two issues, we hear about it nonstop. But what's interesting is that globally, there have been a string of elections in the last few years where the same pearl clutching has gone on in the Western media reporting about those elections.
Right.
The one that comes to mind happened this week in Pakistan. The election of Imran Khan. He's basically the populist nationalist candidate. He's been trying to run in Pakistan for decades. He's had a party for decades, but he never really had any success. Until 2013, he had a good election result, and it's now in their next election where he's been elected prime minister. Let's have a look. Can you pull up, Scotty, I think it's a CNN headline announcing the election of Imran Khan. This is how there we go. You see the question on their mind?
Imran Khan, Pakistan's Trump.
And he's not the only one. They've had headlines like that. The Economist with AMLO in Mexico, his election recently. Oh, the next Trump. He's like Mexico's answer to Trump.
And their beef is that he's nationalist.
The beef is that he's nationalist. But so what? Aren't they all essentially nationalists? No, there's more to it than that. The story of Khan's rise to power is interesting. Here's a few details you probably don't know about Pakistan. So, well, he was elected with a near majority. He has to form a minor coalition government, but he pretty much won outright. He is going to be the next prime minister. He's well known. He has a similarity with Trump, but this is only a superficial one. He's well known in Pakistan as a famous cricketer. So he was a sports star in 80s and 90s. And he was captain of the Pakistani World Cup team that won the cricket in sometime in the early 90s. So he's a star for different reasons. And then he's a star for being a famous, living the high life in London, in the United Kingdom, where he marries an English aristocratic wife, Jemima Goldsmith. But then he gets into politics gradually, and you would think someone like that would have a kind of pro-Western bent and so on and so forth, but he's very much not. He's a conservative, or at least he's grown into the role of a conservative Pakistani leader. He basically formed a new party. This is a similarity with all of the election upsets in the last few years. He formed a new party that is not part of the status quo. It's Pakistan's Tehreek-e-Insaf Party. That's PTI, which in English translates to the Justice Movement. It basically ran on an anti-corruption ticket. You know, so many parties have done that in elections for decades, but in this case, it's had real results because the candidate of one of the two establishment parties that would have run was in prison. So his brother ran instead, and he was tainted by the corruption scandal that actually put his brother in jail. Ironically, it stemmed from leaks in the Panama Papers scandal in 2016. So that's inadvertently brought about a result that the Western status quo would prefer not to see, a populist nationalist candidate. It's amazing that these elections happened. I mean, there was a lot of violence. There has been in Pakistan for a long time. I mean, leaders get assassinated there. In this case, just last week, 4 days before they went to the polls, there was a massive explosion at a polling station, killed 35 people in Quetta. Guess who claimed responsibility? ISIS.
Mm-hmm.
Right there, that's dodgy. I mean, there are lots of groups in Pakistan with either outright terrorist backgrounds, or there maybe can be considered either nationalist, i.e., they're fighting against Indian troops in disputed Kashmir region. There's a grey area where there's some are outright terrorists and some aren't. In this case, ISIS in Pakistan is ridiculous because it's if ISIS claims responsibility, it could be anyone. Mm-hmm. It could have come from anywhere. And almost certainly, I'll just jump straight to it and I'll suggest that that's got to be a kind of externally influenced thing to somehow affect the polls, somehow hurt Khan's rise. It didn't anyway, because the turnout for this was astonishing for Pakistan, 55%. That's more people. You think it's hard to vote in the United States or something. Try doing that when there's a terror campaign going on. I mean, there were grenade attacks in addition to the suicide bombing. 55% turnout, remarkable. Pakistan hasn't had that high a turnout since the 1970s, when Bhutto's father ran. Right. It's clear in Pakistan's case, in a way, this is like the anti-deep state candidate. But on the other hand, it's a bit different in Pakistan, where it's a bit like Egypt, where the military's had a strong influence. They have a very large military, and then they have to for some kind of order in a country of 200 plus million people that's been fighting, terrorism issues for decades. In this case, they kind of signaled that they preferred Khan because they pumped in. They had up to 400,000 troops at polling stations throughout the country for the duration of the campaign. To give you an idea of how many that is, that's like 5 or 6 times the number of troops they posted during the last campaign, which was just as violent. So that kind of signals that they wanted this election to happen because there was already a national groundswell of support for Imran Khan. And it also, by tacit admission, suggests that Pakistan's deep state, its military generals, preferred Khan to win.
Well, the interesting thing about Pakistan is that I think you had this historical low turnouts in polls and stuff because really since its creation in the early 1950s, after it split from the British-controlled Indian Empire into India and Pakistan, 46. Pakistan has been mostly its politics and its security services and stuff have been controlled by Western interests, and that's been known amongst a lot of the voting population in Pakistan. Hence, a kind of a reluctance or people not really seeing the point in going out, or there being a lot of kind of division among the voting population because basically, well, who are we going to vote for? All of these people can be traced back to having links to non-nationalist, basically non-Pakistani governments and agencies and stuff. So
their civilian elite, if you like, their deep state in quotes is. I know I said it was the military. Just forget that for a second. It's essentially the Anglophile remnants of what was left behind by the British Empire. And Khan explicitly addressed the population in those terms. Those English-speaking elites, aren't we all sick of them? Yes, we are, and they voted him in. But it's ironic that he himself is schooled in the. I think he went to university in England as well. Right. So he has gone through the same system. Yeah, he is of the elites.
But it's not necessarily where they come from. It's the extent to which they're willing to sell Pakistan's soul, let's say, and Pakistani nationalism to foreign interests. And most of the leaders since then have done that. If you look at the history of it, and I mean, it's interesting that Benazir Bhutto was probably the last nationalist, truly nationalist leader of Pakistan, and she was murdered effectively by Al Qaeda. So it's
in quotes,
So it's interesting now that you have ISIS, the new incarnation, let's say, of Al Qaeda, who are carrying out bombing attacks at Imran Khan's on the election day. So all of that suggests, that there's certain Western influence, let's say, who aren't interested in any kind of nationalism rising up or taking hold in Pakistan, because nationalism automatically means a re-establishment of sovereignty, and if there are foreign powers who have their foothold in a country, then a nationalist prime minister or leader or whatever who wants to re-establish some kind of sovereignty would end up come into conflict with those people, and it's very well. It's easy to foresee that. It's easier for Western powers to foresee the direction that a certain leader is going to take, So it wouldn't be. I'll put it this way: I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of an attack on Khan himself in the not too distant future, and that he may even be killed. So
right.
Because I mean, this speaks to the topic of the show today, which is the fact that nationalism is a dirty word, has been a dirty word in the West for
70 years
since the Second World War. Really. I mean, nationalism is just one step from, according to a lot of people, nationalism one step away, or that's the preceding step, let's say, to Nazism.
Right.
And totalitarianism, dictatorship, all that kind of stuff, which is complete nonsense, really. It's historically that's complete nonsense. It's only in the last 70 years that's the truth or reality, when it's not really true at all. But of course, getting back to that point that I was making, Western powers, we live under an American empire. We have lived under an American empire, a Western-dominated global order, let's say, and that order has established itself under conditions of let's say globalization, which is the exact opposite of nationalism and populism. It's about opening the entire world up to the strongest and the most cunning or the smartest influences to get access to the world. It's making the world one big country in a certain sense. It's just the planet and everywhere is open, So nationalism is a bad thing, because nationalism is, as we know, associated with kind of like protecting your borders, economic isolationism, protectionism, that kind of thing. And it's just not the way of the world. It's just not the way the world has been, and the modern world has established itself over the past 70 or 80 years since the Second World War. That's not what it's built on. So there's a real pushback against that. Of course, there's a cultural aspect to that as well, and a positive cultural aspect to that, which is that we're all one race. There's only one race. We're all one people. We're all humans, and the whole world is my home type thing. So that feeds into globalization, economic. Let's say the primary aspect of globalization, which is economic, which is giving major corporations access to as much of the world as possible. But to facilitate that, you got to get the people on side. You got to get people, encourage people to be happy with that idea, and you do that by encouraging this idea of one world, one people, one race, open all the borders, free flow of people all around the world. Everybody's my brother, everybody's my sister, that kind of thing, which obviously facilitates globalization, right? Mm-hmm. But it seems that, and that kind of globalization really has only been possible in the context of the kind of world order that we've had since the Second World War. The post-Second World War world order has been dominated by the West and primarily by the USA. So that kind of a globalized world really only works when you have an empire, a major power, a world's greatest superpower that kind of dictates terms to everybody or protects everybody. Kind of like a mafia boss, And so it works only in that context, and in that context, globalization is effectively the world being opened up for these, like I said, these major powers in the West, particularly the USA. But then, as the world changes, as it has done quite dramatically over the past 15 or 20 years, it's no longer possible to that order, that global order under the control of one major superpower, is no longer kind of tenable or no longer possible when you have other countries coming up to, parity level in terms of economic power or military power, or just political, diplomatic power, whatever, or their presence in the world. So you have, China, Russia, and other countries coming online who can compete with and even threaten the hegemony of the US. And that's when, globalization falls apart, basically, that idea of globalization, because, well, you're going to have to redefine it, reconfigure globalization. It's like, it's not just the world open for one country type of thing, or one section of the world, or rather it's these other parts of the world that were previously being exploited now demand a fairer shake.
Yes.
So globalization, as it has been conceived or has been implemented since over the last 70 years, is falling apart now. But people who are exponents of it, like basically American exceptionalists and that kind of thing, they double down on the need to maintain globalization, maintain the liberal world order as led by America, and they obviously look very unfavorably on populism, nationalism, and demonize it effectively because it's, well, I don't know, it's a challenge to America. And that's the strange thing about you get this from the left. Like we just showed a headline from CNN. Radical lefty, not radical lefty, but leftist news, anti-Trump, hates nationalism and stuff. But what they're actually promoting is they're not promoting a better world, you know? They're not, I mean, they're basically the CNN and the likes of CNN on the left effectively are the ones who will, like we've just seen, who will stand on the necks, attempt to stand, you know, figuratively, through their propaganda and through their media outlets will stamp on the necks of any country that attempts to take a more prominent place or to establish itself as its own country and through that gain more rights and a better share of the pie for its citizens. You know, that's effectively what nationalism in Pakistan would do, you know. I mean, a lot of Pakistanis live in poverty and are quite poor, you know. It's
very poor.
And these countries are trying to raise themselves up, and the best way they can raise themselves up is because they are poor in this globalized world as a result of this globalization of the world. So the antidote to that is for them to eke out a little bit of sovereignty and nationalism for themselves and to stand on their own and demand to be treated with a bit more respect and not be the kind of like not be the exploitable country that they have been, you know. But it's strange to see that CNN on the left, supposedly, you know, the bleeding heart lefties type thing, are the ones who are actually trying to stop that from happening because they get to present this as, well, this is Trumpism, this is Nazism, this is populism, this is nationalism. It's all bad because what? Because Hitler. It's just, the whole thing is just so ridiculous. But I mean, CNN are far more. This is a weird thing. CNN are by far, CNN and the likes of them in the US and in the West in particular, are by far more imperialistic, authoritarian, militaristic, and exceptionalist in terms of America than anybody on the right is.
Yeah.
You know, because like nationalism, like by definition, if you want to call Trump a nationalist, although he's not only a nationalist, but that by definition is a pulling the horns in type of thing, pulling America away, at least in theory, from the world. And America hasn't, you know, done an awful lot of good for the rest of the world in terms of the people that have suffered as a result of American expansionism and American imperialism and stuff. And so, and we talked about this before, you know, Trump talking about doing away with NATO. You know, he's made references, whether or not it's possible or whether or not it'll happen, that's a different story, but he's talked openly about whether or not NATO is even useful anymore and whether America should continue to fund NATO. And of course, NATO would collapse or would fall apart if America pulled out of it. But NATO is, what is NATO responsible for? NATO has done nothing except, the only positive thing you can say about NATO is that it has just served there as a supposed protective mechanism. But when it has actually acted in recent years, what has it done? It has destroyed countries and killed thousands of people.
With direct consequences for the places trying to protect Europe, the
right,
wave of immigrants from Africa.
So why would leftist organizations not? Why would they complain about Trump talking about taking NATO apart when it's obviously very much in line with a leftist anti-war, anti-imperialism approach, you know? But they can't see past Trump basically. So because Trump wants it, it's evil, you know. And of course, NATO should be disbanded because NATO, in case anybody has forgotten, NATO was created as a direct response to Soviet Russia and communism and the Cold War. That doesn't exist anymore. So NATO, by definition, is no longer, it has served its purpose. Its raison d'etre does not exist. It doesn't have one anymore. So it makes absolute sense for NATO to go bye-bye because a new world is beginning right now. You know what I mean? People forget that for most people, their history and people who are still alive who grew up during the Cold War and stuff, dude, that's all changed now. You need to let go, you know? And not only is the Cold War finished, but also American hegemony is effectively finished. So you can, you know, and I know it might be hard, but for all the American exceptionalists, you can all stop or begin the process of stop thinking about America as the world's only superpower and the greatest nation in the world and the greatest democracy on earth and the world's policeman. You can just stop doing that now, because if you don't, you're simply delaying the inevitable, and you're just going to, you're running against the wind, as what do you call him? Bob Seger wrote. It's a bad idea, things are changing, and I know it's difficult to kind of like adjust to it, but really, first of all, recognize the fact that things have changed and are changing dramatically, and you need to get with the new wave type thing, it's
I think what's driving America as exceptional isn't patriotism on the part of the US and so-called Western deep state. It's in a country like Pakistan, they benefit. Ironically, they're actually being the conservatives in this day and age because they want to maintain the status quo. They don't want these changes being brought up by those far-right conservative nationalists, in quotes. The status quo is that hot money from Wall Street and London has to be allowed unimpeded to flow into Pakistan, profit quickly, and get the hell out of there before the fire erupts, as it naturally will from the collapse of industry, from a war breaking out, from a string of terrorist attacks. It's a game of chicken where it's an ever-increasing race to get the profit, get the money in, invest, but only to pull it out. It's hot, and we need access. That's why the Southeast Asian, the wider Asian financial crisis happened in the late 90s, and why those countries responded in kind to kind of tamp down and clamp down on the ability of this hot money to flow in and out. That's basically American or Western imperialism today, and that's what they want to be able to keep unimpeded. So when someone like Khan comes in and says, I want to build up Pakistan's industry, I'm going to strengthen our relationship with China, which obviously involves the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor that's already, like you say, it's in the process of happening anyway. It's inevitable. So he is just a political, I suppose he's a political lightning rod for the process that's already underway.
Or a manifestation of something that's already in process, yeah.
And the same with all these other guys everywhere. They're just the political getting in sync with the underlying economic change. On social issues, he's going to be socially conservative. At least he's done that. I'm a religious Pakistani, social values, traditional values. But on the left, on other issues, on economic issues, he's talking about a modern Islamic welfare state for all, building up Pakistan's industry with the help of China. For the last 10 years, he has literally led. He's been at the front of anti-war protest, directly criticizing the United States.
Yeah.
Both in Pakistan with Obama's drone warfare and in neighboring Afghanistan. He's saying this is not working where we fund the Taliban or fund groups counter the Taliban. It's a complete mess of groups against groups. He is adamant that he is coming in now and he's going to solve the Kashmir issue. Kashmir is basically like the bleeding wound of both Pakistan and India. He's a nationalist, but he's not coming in and doing what the usual rhetoric is, which is to be anti-India in Pakistan. That used to get you elected.
Right.
People are electing a nationalist because they recognize a sane, fatherly, actually sincere person who will really help the country in a national way by sitting down and talking with India and actually solving the goddamn bleeding wound.
God forbid, imagine,
Right.
But of course, that's how you rule an empire as well, is that you keep, you want as much kind of tension and conflict as possible between the countries that the empire rules over, because that way it's divide and conquer, right? You keep people at each other's throats, and then they're dependent on you effectively, So yeah, I mean, and there's going to be pushback against that, So I mean, we have a hard time, I suppose, ultimately defining who, and everybody has a hard time defining who this kind of these deep state types are in the US, but I mean, we talk about them being the intelligence agencies and some, high-level members of the intelligence agencies, kind of long-serving kind of bureaucrats, people in think tanks who've been there for a long time, and also politicians, actual serving politicians, very often congressmen who've been there for a long time, and senators who've been there for a long time. I mean, there's no names. You can't identify people. I mean, you could identify people, I suppose, in the intelligence agencies, maybe people like John Clapper, or John Brennan and Clapper. But they're also public faces. There's people behind the scenes who never are never on TV in intelligence agencies as well, But ultimately, those are the people who want to maintain American hegemony and the way the world has been since the Second World War, with America on top, and they don't want to. I mean, that's some people might say it's oversimplified, but there's not many people who can go into the details too much and think too long and too hard about it. So it is a good and a true explanation of why the whole anti-Russian sentiment has happened, and why there's conflict with China, but from the US as well, but particularly with Russia, and why there have been wars in the Middle East. I mean, and the attack on Syria, and why the US intel agencies and the US government, effectively under Obama particularly and under Bush, were basically funding and training Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, to keep sowing discord, to keep countries that are their subjects of empire, keep them destabilized and weak, and therefore reliant on them for help, basically.
Yes.
And the problem is that the media, today Trump comes along, Trump makes noises, talks about wanting to change all of that, not very explicitly, but he talks about wanting to change it, in one way or another, or in different ways, and the media freaks out there really is no anti-war or anti-imperialism sentiment broad, across the board in America, especially not in the media and by anybody who pays attention to the media. Even amongst the ordinary Americans, the vast majority of people who would say they're anti-war and anti-imperialism and stuff, they don't understand how the world actually works, how American imperialism has worked, and what the American government. They don't go deep enough down the rabbit hole to understand how they actually keep the whole thing burning over, keep it ticking over, keep the fighting happening, so that they can maintain empire. And also, the Americans who can't go there, can't see that, are stuck themselves at a personal, emotional level, effectively, with their beliefs that has been engendered or inculcated into them from childhood, effectively, their belief in America as this wonderful, great country, this exceptional country, and that it really should be a shining city on a hill that sheds its light around the world, type of thing. I mean, the Americans are just... There's a number has been done on Americans, a mind F, basically, you know what I mean?
Indeed.
And they're screwed, they can't even... They can't go there, so it's...
They have one key marker, though, that does appeal to a lot of the population, and we can't say how many. It goes in contradiction to what you just said, and the one marker they have for this isn't good, we should really be scaling it down, is that body bags come home every time they either have an outright war of intervention like in Iraq, frankly an invasion, or a humanitarian mission in Libya, etc., etc. And the body bags start coming home and they start to go, you know what? Well, it has serious direct consequences, not just the body bags, but I mean the troops that return and the mental state they're in and the murder rates and the homeless rates of veterans, they do get a real-time feedback taste. It's far weaker than it ought to be, given their splendid isolation over there between the two oceans. But they do have some feedback, and I think they do pick up on that, and that feeds into wanting to not do that anymore, to some extent.
Yeah, but they're stuck. They're caught in a certain sense in that dilemma where they can't get over the idea of America as like I said, as this exceptional nation that has to lead the world, has to be an example to the rest of the world. So and it's sold to them. It's sold to them in a manipulative, duplicitous kind of way as well. They don't really... They're being manipulated, obviously. People are being manipulated by the media in particular. And it's a horrible mess, basically, where the left is supposedly, a supposedly anti-war, anti-imperialist left is actually the one that's encouraging people to maintain American hegemony and therefore American imperialism and by necessity, American warmongering and stoking of conflicts around the world, So... It's an appeal to emotion, basically.
Indeed. Another tidbit about Khan is that he promised not to move into the presidential palace. He'll instead live in his apartment or whatever in Islamabad, and he would instead turn it into an educational institution. That's the kind of thing that's going over very well. I mean, he doesn't need. He's a self-made man. He's very rich, so. That reminded me of Gaddafi, though, living in his tent. He lived in large buildings as well, but promising never to house his parents until every other person in Libya had a roof over their heads. He actually also looks a bit like Gaddafi, Imran Khan. Anyway, So yeah, the Pakistani military apparently likes him, but I suppose the key point here is that it's the Western press doesn't like him. Whenever they get an instinctive, whether it's articulated in the minds of the NYT or CNN, when they're writing either those articles or those headlines, we get an idea of who they don't like, and therefore it tells a lot about maybe not necessarily the exact people who make up the deep state, but it tells us about the dogma that informs it. And the further candidate X in country Y gets away from that dogma, they instinctively go, we don't like him, you know, and it's reading that can tell you an awful lot about what's going on. There's another article I want to pull up here. Scotty, can you get it? It's the New York Times one. This is about their piece on Khan last week. It's only a snapshot of. Here we are. I don't know if people can see that. It's a bit small.
Nuclear armed Islamic Republic gets nuclear armed Islamic Republic gets unpredictable new leader.
Unpredictable.
Yeah.
Unpredictable, of course, is exactly what they think of Trump. Well, partly because he is unpredictable, but he's unpredictable in what he says, but he's actually quite consistent with what he's doing compared with what he said he would do when he was running. But unpredictable is obviously a similarity with Trump. But it tells us a bit more, that term unpredictable. Yeah. It's like we've had Pakistan predictable for 70 years. We like the status quo. We don't want you changing it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Therefore, he's getting away from the dogma, and yes, he's going to end up doing things that we don't like.
Right. That we don't like, but it's going to do with the will of like the average American, let's say, or the average anti-war, anti-imperialist American, or just the average decent American, basically, of which there are many. It's going to do with their will, which would be that, you know, every country should have the right to develop as they kind of see fit, as long as they're not going to bother anybody, and the people should have the right to attempt to prosper, and governments should have the right to do what's in the best interest of their people. And there's no reason to think that Khan wouldn't do that. Everything he says suggests that's what his kind of interest is, that's what his mandate is. And yet the New York Times puts up this headline that basically ever so subtly includes that word, you know, ever so subtly kind of tarnishes him by saying unpredictable. You know, why would you say it's unpredictable? Why would you even call it unpredictable? He's unpredictable, but for the average American reading just that headline, they say, and then you put in nuclear armed. Unpredictable, nuclear armed. Is that a positive headline for the average reader who just reads the headline? Unpredictable nukes. I mean, imagine writing, and that's the New York Times. The New York Times it's lefty as well, right? They're all lefty, right? They're all anti-war, supposedly. They're not, obviously, but that's the way they present themselves, you know. And they're people who read the New York Times who are otherwise decent, ordinary people, but they'll come away from reading that headline with thinking, oh, it's a bit dodgy in Pakistan. And if the government comes along, or if something happens in Pakistan where it goes down the tubes, or Imran Khan gets shot, or something like that, or there's some kind of, you know, conflict rises up there, or the US has to take a more belligerent approach to it, well, then people will have it in their head already as a result of the New York Times and other outlets that, yeah, well, it was a bit unpredictable, and they had nukes as well, didn't they? I mean, people don't distrust the media enough, you know? Or they say they do, but they don't actively distrust it as they're reading the freaking headlines, you know what I mean? And say this. But that takes a lot of work as well, you know? It's a lot of work for someone to look at every headline and try and deconstruct it and figure out. But you can take it as a given, as a general rule, that when any US media outlet is talking about other countries, especially countries that are not part of the West, quote unquote, when there's a negative headline, you can pretty much assume that negative headline is designed to manipulate you for reasons that are not in the interests of the ordinary people in the country that they're talking about. You can assume that, you know, because they're coming from the position of, these are basically the propagandists, the New York Times, CNN, New York, the Washington Post, all the rest. They're propagandists for empire, basically. They've been born and brought up, you know, hooked up to exceptionalism and imperialism for America, and America's the greatest country in the world, and that's all they're ever going to give, you know. And that's quite apart from the kind of vested interests that the owners of these big media outlets actually have in terms of their own, corporate investments around the world and their own corporate interests and their connections with government that are all tied to America remaining, top dog, basically. They have vested interests. And so the idea that America has a free press is absolute nonsense, like we mentioned previously. It's complete and utter nonsense. There's a little video we may as well play now. It's a guy from, his name's Skanky. It's a great name. John Skanky. Is it Skank? I think it's Skanky. John Skanky. No, not Skanky. Stanky. Sorry, Stanky. Close enough. John Stanky is his name, which is just as bad, actually. John Stanky. He's the new boss of AT&T, which recently, earlier this year, bought Time Warner, which owns CNN. So he's basically the new boss at CNN.
Right.
There's just a little thing he said where he was just interviewed by the talking heads on CNN after the merger of the two were approved. And there's just one little thing that he said that kind of stuck out. You'll play it there.
So why was it worth it? Given how hard it was, what is it about us writ large that was so attractive to AT&T?
Well, first of all, it's an incredibly talented company across a lot of different media domains. And we felt it was really important that we have scale and capability to work on content from a variety of different segments. And so just like sitting here, news is very unique from what you might get in scripted long form, but both are very important in terms of how individuals want to consume content. For us over time, the days of being able to get people just to buy connectivity from you are coming to a close because connectivity is becoming very ubiquitous and very similar, and you're going to have to find ways to differentiate your business over time. And there's no better way to do it than with emotional content that customers attach to.
Pause there.
What are you focused on, Brian?
Well, no better way to do it than focusing on emotional content that customers are attached to.
And what about facts and
emotional content? You heard it from the horse's mouth. He's the new CEO of the top dog in the parent company of CNN, and he's on there talking about how he's going to support CNN and that kind of stuff. And he says there's no better way for CNN and all of the companies associated with it to prosper than focus on emotional content that people attach to.
In other words, to manipulate people. Hit the emotions.
But the thing is, he
again and again.
And he can say that, and it doesn't sound bad. At least he doesn't think it sounds bad, and the people on CNN didn't think that was a problem right there. Emotional content that people attach to, and that's obviously, like you just said, it's almost by definition the idea of emotional content is completely separate or in opposition to facts
and journalism
and journalism, telling people the truth about things rather than what they want to hear. Because emotional content is what you're not going to tell people emotional content that they don't want to hear. Most of the time, you're going to tell them stuff that they want to hear, that you think they want to hear. But of course, it also means telling them some bad things in terms of bad things are happening around the world. The world's in some bad things. You show them some, traumatize them a little bit, show them some disaster zones and all that kind of stuff, But emotional content, you appeal to people's emotions, and try and, that it's one step from an admission of there being vested interest there, because you'd have to decide what emotional content is, or what emotional content you want to go with. Is your emotional content going to be to make people say nice things about Trump, or is it going to be say bad things about Trump? Well, that then comes, there's another decision to be made, is what is your political kind of affiliation here? Not even political affiliation, but what's your agenda? Do you have another agenda in terms of pushing a particular type of emotional content that will get people to feel or think a certain way?
And there's other emotions involved here too. Terrorizing and hysterizing people. Right. Hystericizing.
Right.
Making
yeah,
which absolutely. They love doing.
Yeah. Just and then of course Baldy guy from I don't know what his name is, he's ubiquitous on CNN. Baldy guy just then asks him a question. Well, it's pretty obvious the kind of question he asked him, because that's all CNN obsessed about. Play just the next little bit.
You said to me the other day, CNN has a special social responsibility compared to, TNT or TBS or the Cartoon Network. And I think what I hear from staffers here, they wonder, well, what happens when CNN's Jim Acosta the other day is told by the campaign manager of the Trump campaign, you should have your credentials revoked? What happens in that environment when it's not Time Warner, it's Warner Media?
Mm-hmm. So anyway, he goes on. So his main question is, what are we going to do about Trump? He said, you said, talking to the boss guy, you said that CNN has a special social responsibility. So on that point, what are we going to do about Trump?
Yeah, what's our corporate responsibility policy?
No, not just what tack we take on Trump, but what are we going to do about Trump? It's obviously a foregone conclusion that we got to do something about Trump. But how would you help us in dealing with this Trump business? You know, and of course the stanky man said he just gives some non-answer basically. Well, it's very important to do stuff and in a certain way that does stuff. Something non-answer. A non-answer, basically, So, but obviously they have an agenda, Absolutely. And people at his level, they're basically the CEO of the parent company, the kind of top guy is. But then the question, he's got an agenda. That's the whole question. Does it come down to one individual? Is it his agenda that dictates what happens on CNN? Or obviously there's other people associated. There's actually a CEO of CNN.
There are boards.
There's boards and all that kind of stuff. But is it all those people, or is it something else? Is there someone in the kind of people in the deep state, let's say, in intel agencies and stuff? But it's all quite complicated. We talked about this previously on other shows as well about how reporters like on CNN or New York Post or Washington Post or New York Times or whatever rely heavily, never more so, rely on intelligence agencies in Western countries for their stories, basically. Not all stories, but some stories, especially political stories. How many times have you seen a CIA source or an FBI source or just a source close to the investigation told CNN that this is what's going down? And that becomes a story, If you read a lot of stories on what's going on, what's really happening in politics, which serves a particular agenda, is validated or credited to some unnamed person. A lot of times they don't even say in the intelligence agency. They simply say that it's close to the investigation. Who the hell? That could be Santa Claus, But it's more than likely somebody in politics or in intelligence agencies who are drip feeding information, and it's taken as gold. It's like this. Listen, I'm your source, and I know this happened. Why? Well, here's my credentials. I work in the CIA. I work in the FBI. I know what's going on. And I can't tell you how I know what's going on. I can't give you any evidence for it, but take it from me. This is what's happening. And they can so easily get information into the mass media in that way, and it becomes a freaking headline. And if you look at a headline, then you find out, well, how do they know this? And you go down and you find it's blah, 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 blah. Source said so. Unnamed source close to the investigation said so. That's the only evidence they have for putting out major headlines that inform public opinion, and can turn people's heads one way or another. And
that's assuming they even actually got it from an actual
sometimes
source.
They may not, yeah.
They just write it down. Because, there are a lot of situations where it's a White House leak. And you're like, really? Someone leaked data about that? Or did someone just claim it? And they made up a version of what happened. And that's happened before. I've noticed it where actually a few days later, that thing that we said was leaked, it didn't happen. They wanted to beat the White House, Trump's White House, to the first impression from a meeting with whoever, a foreign dignitary or someone in the US. So they leaked that first impression. And, we're only getting it from our source and we can't confirm it. Blah, blah, blah. But that's because someone in CNN or at the NYT just made it up.
Mm-hmm. It's quite possible, yeah. That's the level of...
So it's not even a real leak. It's a fake leak.
Yeah. That's the level of hubris and... Not hubris, but, lies and misinformation and disinformation. It's packaged up, They've got so good at it now that they package up their lies in a nice, truthy appearing kind of box, and feed it to you. You swallow it. It's like freaking cyanide coated in sugar type thing, And it's bad for you, It's bad for people. But again, people are stuck because they don't have the time or the energy or the inclination, let's say, to really try and figure all that out. And it is a web, It's a very complicated web, and there's very few people, if anybody, could figure it all out. But you can get a general read on it,
Yeah.
You can give a general overview of, look, this seems to be what's happening, and this plausible theory, or this theory is plausible because it fits, it maps to the way things are going in the world, where things are effectively getting worse for the average person, but they're being contained, or people are being held in this kind of bubble where they're kind of protected from that by the media, and they're told all the wrong things by the media, basically, that don't inform them or don't allow them to really take stock of the situation and make life decisions based on accurate information, and that can be deadly, ultimately deadly if things don't pan out as everybody would like them to, things take a pretty serious turn for the worse, people will not be prepared, and certainly in America, people in America should be being prepared for some kind of a downgrading of America as the global hegemon, but they're not. They're not being encouraged to think that way at all, and they can't. I suppose they've been brought up that way, and it's too far gone. You can't undo that kind of a belief system when it's standing up in first or second grade or whatever age they do it in school and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff. That's a pernicious level of indoctrination that you're not going to undo in a 40 or 50-year-old person, except to the extent that the person might be able to undo it themselves, or have the qualities to see how that's not good,
Well, love of the country in itself may not be the pernicious thing. What's pernicious is that something else was layered over it in all these decades, whereby, as we saw and discussed last week, when people freaked out about Trump meeting Putin and called it the treason summit and put it down to the clarifying choice of who do you believe, the evil Russian president or a patriotic intelligence community, i.e. the deep state, that there's been this the specific mind job is that intense patriotism, reciting the anthem every morning, has been used to get people to understand and accept that there is basically a permanent government, a deep state, and the tenets of its dogma rule, and anyone who transgresses it is a traitor, including the president. The president can be up for treason if he transgresses the tenets of those dogma. And just to kind of confirm what we discussed this week, there was actually we missed it at the time. I think it was out on just the day before, a Washington Post editorial. I'm not going to have Scotty pull it up because it's behind a paywall. I don't know if we'll be able to see it, but people should check it out if they can see it. Washington Post, it's an editorial, so it's an op-ed. It's written by one of their in-house editors, Eugene Robinson, titled "God Bless the Deep State." His opening paragraph is poo-pooing this supposed deep state, and it's in quotes. But the rest of the article is basically a litany of Trump's crimes, his transgressions against precisely said deep state. And he concludes it by saying, in this emergency, the national crisis that the United States is in, the loyal and honorable deep state has a higher duty. It's called patriotism. And deep state here isn't, in scare quotes, as if to poo-poo the conspiracy. He poo-pooed it at the beginning of his article, but then he actually just basically said, yeah, it's real, and God bless it, thank God, because without it, we would just have Trump and we'd be screwed. And he finishes by saying, the honorable deep state has a higher duty. It's called patriotism. Again, the confluence of that hand on the heart, intense nationalism and jingoism that Americans have been stuffed with all these decades is directly conflated with the higher duty to your patriotism, to your secret government, your secret masters, or the tenets that they hold.
Patriotism.
Sacred.
It says the honorable deep state has a duty to a higher goal.
It's higher duty, which is patriotism. Trump doesn't have it. He's treasonous and he's against our country. He's an anti-patriot. But the deep state, thank God for its existence, is patriotic, and it saves us from a traitor like Trump.
Right. But that leaves out the people of America, though, no? I mean, are these deep state are supposedly working in the interest of the American people? Of course they're not. Because at least 50% of voters, anyway, didn't vote for them, voted for Trump.
They in their reality creation, they believe that the majority, I mean, they whatever shenanigans they pull during the 2016 election, they're convinced that Hillary won the popular vote, even though she couldn't get 50 people to turn up at her rallies.
Who's convinced?
Well, it's a truism now that Hillary won the popular vote by several million.
But people in the know that that's not the case. Right? They're liars.
It's non-stop reported as fact.
But they lie with every breath they take, basically. You know what I mean? These are people who... Any leadership in any country, regardless of whether it's covert or overt, has a responsibility to preparing the people of that country to face reality in the most graceful and kind of productive and positive way possible. You know, to help people to confront reality and deal with the future and deal with changing times in the world. But what the deep state in the US, whatever you want to call it, are doing exactly the opposite of that. Yeah. Trump is the one who's actually trying to prepare America and American people for a changing world. Yes. Like we said earlier on in the show, there is there's major change, major global shift underway in terms of the balance of power in the world, and America is not top dog anymore, and is certainly not going to be top dog, and that's a big adjustment for America to make, and most importantly for the American people, because it's going to affect them most particularly, because it'll have economic implications and all that kind of stuff. But those people are denying that it's happening and trying their best to prevent the change from happening and to convince the American people to support them in preventing a change from happening. You know,
yeah,
it's like there's a tidal wave coming. You know, you can see it on the horizon. You know. And some people are going, yeah, that tidal wave might be getting a bit closer. And your government is saying, no, ignore that tidal wave. Don't be so stupid. That's actually Russian propaganda. That's a Russian manipulation. It's actually a hologram. It's not a tidal wave. And it's just Russia's out to get us. We are here and we will stay here. And that tidal wave doesn't even exist, actually. And anybody who does is fake news. You know, it's nonsense. It's lies. It's propaganda. I mean, that's highly, highly irresponsible, you know? And that tidal wave is a tidal wave, a sea change, or a change in, like I've been saying, in the global power balance. And Americans need to prepare themselves for it. And if they're kept in this kind of tractor beam almost, where they're held in stasis, where they're not doing anything about it, where they're not recognizing, not foreseeing it coming, then the hammer's going to fall pretty hard on them when it does happen, because they're going to be completely unprepared.
Or to follow your analogy, the sheer weight of that water.
Yeah,
it's a good analogy. And Americans are least... They wanted to. I mean, they elected Trump, right? There's probably going to be a red wave in the upcoming elections for Congress, contrary to the so-called blue wave. But yeah, they're really hamstrung by being closest, if you like, in ideologically, whatever about geographically, to this reality creation, this bubble of how the world they think actually works.
Yeah.
But other countries, with the distance of both geography and then ideology, it seems to be easier for them to elect a leader and a party, and thus a counterbalance that's in sync with the changing world. In Eastern Europe, it's been able to happen in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, of course, with Viktor Orban. In Western Europe, it's having a hard time translating into reality because there have been populist, nationalist leaders, but they haven't been elected yet, or they're on the verge of it. Germany, again, is on the brink. Merkel just about got through. But in countries like Pakistan, it's able to happen. It's still remarkable for their own context, but still, it could actually happen.
But populism and nationalism is popular among any people.
Yeah.
Any kind of coherent or cohesive, group of people who have lived in a geographic area for quite a long period of time. The idea of nationalism is just the same as community spirit, basically. It's about identifying with. It's identity politics. It's identifying with the people who live in your. It's just an extension of, for example, the people who live in your house, then the people who live in your community, then the people who live in the bigger town, then the people who live in the bigger city. You're from that city, so you identify with being from that city. Then expand that out. I mean, it has limits, obviously, and global is too much, obviously, but it's also constrained and has been constrained throughout history by ethnicity, as well, and religion. And there's nothing wrong with that, for people to identify with people who share their same cultural values, and that there's an extension of that to skin color in a certain sense. It doesn't mean that people of other skin colors can't actually incorporate into that, but it doesn't. It doesn't mean that that's it's insignificant, let's say, depending on the country. That skin color is insignificant depending on the country, you know, that, and that it's something evil or bad, you know. I'm glad. And it gives people, you know, that idea, sense of community and sense of community values and similar cultural values. It's just something that makes people feel more content, live a more meaningful life, or feel like more, I suppose, more comfortable and more part of an identity, part of something, you know. It gives them a sense of stability and belonging, let's say, you know. And that's effectively where nationalism comes from in the average person. But that's absolutely has been demonized because Hitler.
Which is, I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the key tenets of the dogma is precisely the Hitler issue, and specifically the ethnicity issue. In the dogma, nationalism is bad because it encourages, feeds, leads to, grows into an ethnic, my in-group, my tribe-based view of the world, and that leads to a war and decimation of one ethnicity against another. Well, there's another interesting case study from this year also that took place in another Muslim-majority country, in Malaysia. I think it was in May. They had elections, and for the first time since another post-colonial British mess, for the first time ever, a party other than the established one left behind was also voted into power. And it was led by someone who has previously been in government, let's pronounce his name right, Mahathir Mohamad. The guy's 92 years old. He's basically come out of retirement to lead the first successful election of someone who wasn't the established ruling UNMO party. Now, Malaysia is an interesting case study because its population today is just under 70% is Malay. Then there's a large Chinese minority, almost a quarter of the population, and a smaller 7% or Indian extraction. The ruling party was founded also in 1946 to keep Malaysia as a Malay-dominated, ethnic-based country. It's actually built into their constitution, and there are special privileges for native Malays. So for 59 years, they've won all the elections until this one. For a party that specifically did not run on that, it ran on a nationalist, but here nationalist was not ethnic-based. It was what's best for the country. It was also an anti-corruption drive, which is already bearing fruit. The previous Prime Minister is in prison, or he's awaiting trial, I'm not sure. It's nationalist, but it's not the fear, it's not the tenet of the fear of nationalism. It was going against the trend they said would happen, that there would be an ethnic-based nationalism and genocide of one ethnicity against another. They actually bucked the trend they had previously been in, which was voting based on ethnicity, to vote on what's best for the country as a whole. And ironically, in this case, this is not. In Pakistan's case, there was widespread support for the strengthening of ties with China, because in that situation, Pakistan's caught between Afghanistan and India, and Chinese investment is good for Pakistan. In Malaysia, they're upset with Chinese investment because it's been producing at least some bad fruit. A lot of the corruption comes from a lot of hot money that comes in from Chinese investment. So Mahathir ran on not nixing and not an anti-Chinese platform, but at least on revising some of the deals, because the development's been unequal and unbalanced for a lot of poor Malays. So yes, there was a nationalist overthrow of a regime for almost seven decades, but ironically, it goes against the very claim that they have that nationalism is bad, because, you know, if people are basing on their in-tribe on an ethnicity basis, that can only lead to negative problems. Yeah. And again, he's an older guy. Like Imran Khan, he's an older guy. He's a bit different because he's been a prime minister before. He oversaw Malaysia's transformation in the 90s. It's modernization. It's industrialization, basically.
You know, he's a 9/11 conspiracy theorist as well.
Right.
He held war crimes tribunals and stuff, and about the Iraq War and stuff in Malaysia. You know, he basically set them up and had the hearings and stuff, you know, and he believes that 9/11 was an incite, was a false flag attack.
And at least publicly, he's pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel. I think it's Malaysia is a country that specifically states in their passports that Malay citizens are not allowed into Israel.
Yeah.
But again, he's 92. He's another older, experienced man, and experienced specifically in this case in politics. And he's a kind of a father of the nation figure.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an economic nationalist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, anybody who wants to break free of the chains of empire, let's say, and they can do that now at a certain time, but during a certain period of time, it served people well enough. You know, the countries that were just developing at the time, it served them well enough. They got investment from the US, and US companies were set up and stuff. But now, as the world has progressed and technology has progressed, and the economy is, global economy is improving and all that kind of stuff in the countries, infrastructure, globalized infrastructure, which the US set up, or the US basically oversaw, let's say, to maintain their imperialism, has actually worked against them in the sense that it has empowered these nations now to kind of stand on their own 2 feet. And to break away from those chains of empire, they're going to have to engage in a certain amount of nationalism, of economic nationalism. And the problem is that economic nationalism, in order to sell economic nationalism, you generally have to talk about kind of, cultural nationalism, let's say, or nationalism in general. It has to be national sentiment. There is going to be national sentiment that encourages economic, because you can't start saying we, the Malays, need to stand up for our economic rights against those Americans without kind of like engendering a little bit of animosity, and also a tendency to be more kind of like cohesive, a nationalistic or patriotic feeling amongst the people. Malaysia for Malaysians, or something along those lines. So it's and it's not necessarily a problem, and it's, the whole nationalism is bad thing just comes from, like, we're talking about Hitler and the Second World War, and the fact that, nationalism caused basically World War II and the death of 65 million people, blah, 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 blah. But it's not the same. You can't just take it from then and supplant it today, and anybody who talks about nationalism or populism today is automatically going to turn into Hitler or be a Nazi. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. That's the level of, the freaking idiotic level of thinking, that goes on. It just blows my mind, and
we have another case study, another recent election in Mexico. So here, another key tenet of the nationalism leads to evil, and all these nationalist leaders is a dark turn for the world. Here's another key tenet, that they are far right. Far right, populist national leaders, they're everywhere. Mexico. Scotty, can you pull up The Economist? This was their cover story and title of their article before he was actually voted in. I think it was about a month beforehand.
AMLO,
that's the acronym for his long Mexican name. Mexico's answer to Donald Trump. The guy is a lefty. And I don't mean lefty like ultra-liberal New York cosmopolitan, hipster lefty. I mean like workers' rights, trade union. He's similar to Jeremy Corbyn, that he's been a politician for a good long decades. He's ran before. He thought it was stolen from him in the 2006 election, the presidential campaign for Mexico. He's been the mayor of Mexico City. People there feel positively about him. And finally, at age, again, I think he's pushing 70 something, he finally gets elected. But the key point there is that here's a lefty. He's left beyond the left of the establishment.
Hang on a minute. The left.
And he's a nationalist. He's Mexico's Trump.
So the lefty media are accusing him of being like Trump. And he's a lefty. So you have leftist media accusing a leftist of being like Trump, which kind of makes sense. Well, you have leftist media accusing a leftist Mexican prime minister of being like Trump because he's talking about workers' rights, which is a leftist thing, a leftist kind of agenda. But Trump also has been, part of his presidency and part of his campaign, certainly, and since then, has been defined by his interest in and desire or interest in workers' rights in America. So Trump is a leftist as well then. So what does that make CNN? A bunch of right-wing deep staters.
Well, again,
but these terms break down. It's nonsense.
You have to look at the specific details. One of Trump's key things when he ran was $1 trillion infrastructure investment plan. That's FDR stuff right there. That's left.
Yeah, but and also bringing back jobs and looking after the
American workers,
the blue-collar workers and all that kind of stuff. That's the little people. That's the proletariat. That's raise up the proletariat. That's communism.
What all of these guys have in common is that they're socially conservative, but they're old left when it comes to the economy, to the well-being of all.
Right, social conservatism,
and Trump,
economic.
Trump, more than anyone else, knows he wants to get rich and what it takes to get rich and what the best kind of environment is for him to get rich. And something else. He's not just sending his money abroad and getting the best returns via hedge funds. He actually wanted to build a company where there would be real Americans working in it. And if they're too sick to come to work, what good is it? So he sees it in very pragmatic terms, but he ends up inadvertently being the classic marriage of the left when it comes to the economy and the right when it comes to social values. And that is the syncing up of what makes a nationalist leader in the healthiest sense of that term. And that's why all these guys are like kryptonite to the establishment, the global establishment. So this is a snippet from The Economist special. It was a cover story in April or May. What is about to happen? So it was sure he was going to be elected because he was leading the polls. What is about to happen in Mexico is similar to the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the vote of Great Britain to leave the European Union, and the turn of Italy towards populism. In their mind, it's crystal clear. They really... Can they articulate it further? I didn't get much from the Economist article. I doubt they can, really. You'd probably have to sit down and get them to write a freaking book or a treatise on it. But I think it's really something system one. It's instinctive first, and then they write this. It's all similar. They can't really articulate why it is.
Yeah, they don't know. They're idiots, basically. They're just mind programmed. I mean, they're mind programmed, like we're saying earlier on the show. These people are they're acting out a belief system that they have no real awareness of and have no real understanding of the implications of its application, let's say. They're just going with what feels good to them, which is, system, like a lower level consciousness program that's running.
Yeah.
And they've been fed it, and they've been made that way. And there's no conscious awareness, no consciousness brought to bear on it to decide whether or not this is right, whether or not what I believe, what I strongly feel, or what I strongly believe is actually appropriate or the right thing to do. There's no sense of responsibility in that respect, for doing the right thing. It's just go with what makes me feel good. What makes you feel good is very often things that have been programmed into you by other people. So you're basically an automaton, and you're dangerous for that reason.
The Economist is obviously nominally a British publication, but it's read, in Western capitals the world over. But just in case there's any, it wasn't unique to them. The Washington Post, before AMLO was elected, ran this op-ed, title of which is "The Future President of Mexico is Very Similar to Trump." If Mexicans elect López Obrador, they will be, like the voters who supported Trump, exploiting the status quo without a reliable sense of what will replace it. The result is likely to be a bigger problem on both sides of the border. They don't know why, but it's not good. It's going to be bad. Yeah. It's insane. And again, AMLO has the same characteristics, I suppose, as Mahathir in Malaysia, as Khan in Pakistan. He's 65, consistently old school leftist. He's finally in power. He's been a politician the whole time, but he's never actually become president, of course, till now. So again, he's another experienced father of the nation type figure and an economic nationalist. Which, for me, all of this brings me to the UK. Jeremy Corbyn. I tried to make this argument with some Corbynistas when they were rabidly protesting Trump and his visit in London a couple of weeks ago. I was saying, guys, what do you do realize that Corbyn is your Trump? Well, no, never. He's not a Nazi. He says nice things. He wants to make the world a better place. He doesn't want to destroy it all, and the usual litany of stuff. So they're taken superficially, but they don't realize that their deeper attraction to Jeremy Corbyn is that he's, again, a father of the nation type figure. In his case, also very experienced politician, but sidelined because the whole system had gone so radically this way in all these decades. And now finally the popular will is someone. Jeremy Corbyn stayed right where he is. He's been consistent the whole time. He's just stood there, out on the fringes of Parliament, leading some protests, meeting some world leaders or other figures internationally who are terrorists and you should never meet with them. He's been consistent. And then the people are ready to sync up with that at the right time. Come at the hour, come at the man kind of thing. Reverse of the saying. But I think Corbyn articulated it. He didn't. He of course will. He'll hate what I'm saying. And he would distance himself from Trump. But this week he put out a detail in part of a speech, a detailed economic plan for the UK. It's basically MAGA. It's build it in Britain. It's bring home all the capital we've been sending all over the world, hot cash from London to make high profits for a few who don't actually live here, or don't even pay their taxes here, who have no real ties to the nation. He's going to try the same thing and draw that capital back and rebuild industry and build it in Britain, basically made in the UK. They're going to actually start making stuff again instead of just sending weapons abroad and hot money that destroys other countries. It's a classic lefty, old school left, national industry, at least some government control of key industrial sectors. It's precisely what the far right new Hitler, Vladimir Putin, did to Russia in the last couple of decades. It's not total control of the state. They've obviously had their experience with Soviet ideology, and they're not doing that again. But they did wrest back control of certain sectors. And Corbyn now wants to do the same thing. He is, in short, another fatherly figure of the nation and an economic nationalist. He's a Donald Trump.
Yeah. So speaking of the UK, I mean, Corbyn has a lot of leeway to kind of say that kind of stuff now because of the complete shambles that is going on in the ruling party, in the Conservative Party, over Brexit. That's all they've done. They've basically done nothing for the past 3 years except Brexit. I mean, the country obviously runs itself without this bunch of idiotic politicians, picking their noses and, messing things up. But that's all. That's what they've had to busy themselves with over the past 2 or 3 years since Brexit. Basically, nothing else has been going on except what are we going to do with Brexit? How are we going to deal with Brexit? How are the negotiations going? Are they going anywhere? I don't know. I don't think they are. Is it going to be a hard Brexit? Is it going to be a soft Brexit? Is anything going to happen at all? Nobody knows, but it takes a lot of airtime and gets a lot of people's faces on TV. But we've predicted, or more particularly, I predicted maybe not from the get-go, but from the start almost.
We need some applause here.
From the start almost that it wasn't going to happen. That and it was obvious that it was not going to happen. There's no way the UK can actually extricate itself from the European Union. It's been there for 50 years at least.
They're in too deep.
They're way in too deep. Their entire economy is just so intertwined with the European economies and the EU economy in general that, it's suicide, It's just such a bad idea. And I've been waiting for over the past 6 months, year or so, I've been waiting for some campaign to get going to start the process of a second referendum, because that seemed to me to be the most, the really only way that they could get out of the Brexit quagmire was to undo what caused it in the first place, which was having a referendum and then the vote being that, yes, a majority of people want to leave the EU. Now they'll have to. But leading up to a second referendum, I've been watching and waiting, because leading up to it, you would have to have a process of scaring the public into agreeing to another referendum, or getting enough political capital to announce another referendum, and then be sure, have scared the people enough that they would vote yes or no this time that we want to stay within the EU. Now that campaign has been, the shambles that's been going on with the Tory government and the whole shit show that has been the Brexit negotiations, and how May has just been made look like a complete idiot, along with their entire cabinet, or entire government, and the resignation of some high-profile members and all that kind of stuff over Brexit. It's getting to the point where it's just, this is obviously a disaster. And if you were really going to push that message home of we need another referendum and see what happens, you would scare people into saying, increase the fear factor about what will happen if there is, which is increasingly likely, or that's the way they're making it happen, is increasingly likely there's going to be a hard Brexit, i.e. the UK will leave with no deal whatsoever. It'll just be cut adrift and screwed. So there's been led by the independent UK newspaper. Yeah, this is the kind of scaremongering I was talking about. God help us, British Army on standby in case of no deal Brexit supply issues. So that's basically the British Army this is stories coming out, and actually, scroll down a little bit. So it actually says that right there, ministers planning Brexit told the media. This is the key point here that stuck out for me, was that this isn't the independent, a lefty organisation that would be anti-Tories and is anti-Brexit. This is actual Theresa May's Conservative government ministers. Supposedly pro-Brexit on song with the government's agenda of pushing Brexit through, telling the media that the army is on standby to deliver key supplies like food, fuel, and medicines in the eventuality of a no-deal scenario.
Right.
So that's basically May herself, who is supposedly, out of one side of her mouth, she's saying, no, we're going to fulfill the will of the British people. We're going to have Brexit. We're going to get the best deal possible, and it's a done deal. And under no circumstances will there be another referendum. We're doing Brexit, and that's it. Out of one side of her mouth. Yeah. Out of the other side of her mouth, via her ministers, she's trying to scare people with these kind of stories, scare them into wanting a second referendum,
right?
Wanting to undercut her position.
And that's why then she closed Parliament early this year, and they all went on summer holidays,
right? Because
they don't want
disaster.
They want that. There's nothing to negotiate as far as they're concerned.
Right.
They're going to bring about a situation where there has to be a second round, where people will clamour for it.
Right. But citing statistics and all that kind of stuff as well, saying that since, this is how long it's been, I didn't realise it was this long, but since the Brexit referendum happened, there are something like 2 million or 1.6 million teenagers have come of age, voting age, and that they are in a demographic or of a political persuasion that, well, they're anti-Brexit basically. So that number of new voters who are anti-Brexit is more than the margin of victory that the supporters of Brexit got. So that if we have a referendum today, a majority of the people, according to the Independent, a majority of voters in the UK, there would be enough voters in the UK who would say no, who would overturn the decision. So they're really pushing hard on it, you know.
Yeah, but they still might need to rig it.
Yeah,
the election in some way.
Wow, that's easy enough. Referendum.
Done. Well, call me a conspiracy theorist, but
you're a conspiracy theorist.
The timing of the announcement of Brexit, the hold a referendum. No, it happened first, I think. I looked into this before. I was wondering if that came after Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. I think the Brexit referendum was announced beforehand, but only by several months. Then Corbyn was elected. But I think everything that's happened since then, the delaying and so on, the talking out of one side of the mouth and then doing this in the background, I think it's done, especially since Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, with one eye. One eye only on the foreign aspect, the UK and the EU, are we in or not? And the other eye on Jeremy Corbyn. And or someone like him who will come up and effectively change the regime into a popular nationalist run government like all these other countries are seeing all over the world. Because that is the death knell. I mean, his thing where Britain will re-industrialize, do you understand the enemies he will have? I mean, I've wondered, by the way, this is kind of a side note, but I wondered if Trump's whole trade wars, if you look in the details on what he would actually like to do, it's basically trying to draw back American capital. It's not really about having a war with country X and country Y. it's a roundabout war. It's a cover story for the war against, an effort to get American capital back from those cheap labor countries and producing again the United States. In Corbyn's case, he's articulated it clearly. He's not hiding behind something. He says, I want that capital back. That'll make it even harder to do, I suspect, because if you're straight on engaging these hedge funds in London, and the deep state has a big branch of its hydra in London, of course.
There's one thing I wanted to say before we call it quits here. And it's something that really annoys me and is indicative of probably most of the world's problems, at least certainly in the West, all of the social problems in the West today, is people's inability, or rather people's proclivity to think only in black and white terms, or to only be able to think in black and white terms. Like, I've come across on Facebook and social media and on websites, on our own website and that kind of stuff, in the comments section, of people showing a complete inability to think in kind of nuanced terms and to realize that things are not black and white, and to assume or be able to understand that there are people who don't think that way, people who aren't into picking a side, who aren't automatically on the left or the right, however it's defined today. It seems to be fairly well defined between left and right. You've got the nationalists, the right wingers, the Nazis, and you've got the lefties, the multiculturalists, that kind of thing. Broadly speaking, right? People are active anyway. I'm sure there's a great silent majority out there who don't say anything about this and haven't really made up their own minds. But the people who are actually active all seem to be either of one stripe or another, right? They're all, at least that's what's presented to people, that people are in one camp or the other. And for otherwise intelligent people, it's amazing for me to see that they're unable to conceive of the idea that that people like us, for example, would exist, where we're not pro-Trump and we're not pro-multiculturalism. We're not pro this or pro that. We're not, die hard, inscribed in stone for this and against that, or vice versa. That basically we take every situation on its merits and we're interested in the truth of a situation, the truth being associated with what is good and what is bad for, let's say, society in general, or what can be assumed is a good direction or a bad direction based on historical lessons and based on understanding of human beings and how they operate psychologically and all that kind of stuff. That you would, in any given situation, you might say something positive about Trump or right-wing movements in essence, or say that there are some positive aspects to it. And then in another situation, you would say there are some positive aspects about left-wing movements, But as soon as you open your mouth, even if you're commenting on one situation and you happen to take a more leftist or more rightist approach on any one specific situation, as soon as someone hears you saying that, then you're condemned as a Nazi or a libtard. Mm-hmm. Obviously people would have to follow you and see what you're saying, but there are people, the people I'm talking about are people who follow you and follow me or are looking at what I'm saying, but they still don't seem to be able to understand that I'm not right-wing or left-wing. That's a stupid designation to make. You know what I mean? That in any given situation, it's like, so what's your stance on this? What's your opinion? Are you left or right on this? But that's like reducing it to a ridiculously simplistic level that is totally irrelevant to the nuanced and complex nature of the topic that you're discussing. Mm-hmm. So why are people so idiotic and stupid that they can't conceive of that idea that any half-intelligent person would have to come at each situation and judge it based on its merits? And the result being that you may sound a bit like a right winger or you may sound a bit like a left winger, but you're freaking neither. What's wrong with people? Because they want to pigeonhole you? Because it's simple, right? It's easier. They want to put you in a box and it's done. Now I know who you are.
Because they grew up with bad parents. And I don't mean their actual flesh and blood parents who did the best they could under the circumstances. I mean bad parents in the sense of government regimes. The government would have them think in black and white in perpetuity forever and never actually think through a situation because it suits it's divide and conquer, isn't it? It's classical. Where do you stand on this? Are you one or the other? And then it's easier to raise a mob that way. It's easier to push through legislation that way. It's easier to start civil wars if you wanted to, like Syria that way. It comes down to bad parenting. The parent themselves either. So I'm thinking here of the self-appointed wise men of, say, in Washington or in Paris or London or wherever they are. It's either because they themselves see the world in those black and white terms, or worse, more pernicious.
They want people to see it.
Them to.
Yeah, they want people to see it in those terms.
They want, like your head there of the new head of CNN articulated and said, we are good, emotional-based things that people are attached to, i.e. we're going to keep you attached by keeping you manipulated.
Right.
By giving you black and white.
Oversimplified versions of events that are not reflective of...
By reporting a story about a dog that was rescued from a car and having resistance. They've been doing that. They just have anti-Trump slogans scrolling across the bottom of the screen while they're reporting about the heat wave in Minnesota or something.
Yeah.
That's bad parenting.
It's worse than that. It's consciously evil parenting. And those people need to pay. And I hope someday they will, somehow. But if not... well, we'll just struggle on. And we'll try and keep things as sane as possible in the meantime. We'll do our best anyway to do that. So, yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Thanks for watching. If you liked this, if you're watching the video version, if you liked it, please subscribe. And I think you have to push some other buttons or whatever. I'm not quite up on that. It's on the
notifications button.
Click the notifications button as well.
Click the bell.
Click the bell. There you go. You got to click the bell these days, like Pavlov's dog. So yeah, until next time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again. Bye.
See y'all. Bye bye.